What if I told you that before Prince Philip died, he left something behind that nobody was supposed to find? Not just a letter, something far more dangerous, a set of private conditions quietly enforced for years that kept Camilla exactly where Philip wanted her. Now those conditions have been broken, and Charles is furious. The clock started ticking the moment Charles and Camilla said "I do." Prince Philip sat in that Windsor Register office on April 9th, 2005, and he did not smile. Not once. Cameras caught it. Royal correspondents noted it. But what the cameras didn't catch, what has only emerged through years of careful reporting and palace insiders willing to talk, was what Philip said behind closed doors after that ceremony. He called it a mistake. Not quietly, not in passing, a mistake. Philip had watched Charles's marriage to Diana collapse from the inside. He had seen the affairs, the manipulation, the deliberate cruelty that broke one of the most beloved women in British history, and he knew exactly who he held responsible. Not Charles alone, Camilla. Philip's loyalty to Diana ran deeper than most people understood. It wasn't simply affection for a daughter-in-law, it was institutional. Diana represented everything Philip believed the monarchy needed to survive: youth, public connection, sacrifice, discipline. Camilla represented the opposite, a twice-divorced woman whose relationship with Charles had shadowed the Prince of Wales for decades, a woman Philip believed had undermined the succession, destabilized the institution, and handed the Republican movement in Britain the greatest gift it had ever received: the death of Diana. Philip never said this in a television interview, but sources close to the Duke of Edinburgh have been consistent on one point across multiple accounts. Philip did not consider Camilla a suitable queen. Not in 1997, not in 2005, not ever. But Philip was also a pragmatist. He understood that Charles was going to marry Camilla regardless of his objections. He understood that opposing it publicly would cause damage far greater than accepting it quietly. So Philip made a calculation. He would not publicly oppose the marriage, but he would not make it easy either. There were conversations, private, serious, and according to sources, surprisingly blunt, between Philip and senior palace officials in the months before the 2005 wedding. Philip wanted assurances, not about the wedding itself, about what came after. He wanted to know that Camilla's role would be limited, that she would not overshadow the institution, that certain traditions, certain lines would not be crossed. Those close to Philip at the time describe him as unusually focused on this point, not angry, not emotional, focused, like a man drawing a boundary he intended to enforce. The public saw a Duke of Edinburgh who attended the blessing at St. George's Chapel with quiet dignity. What they didn't see was the man who had spent weeks making sure that dignity came at a price. And here is what makes this so significant. Philip lived another 16 years after that wedding. 16 years during which Camilla slowly, carefully, strategically expanded her presence within the royal family. 16 years during which she moved from wife of the Prince of Wales to a figure of genuine institutional power. And throughout all of it, throughout every public appearance, every carefully managed press briefing, every subtle repositioning, Philip watched. Those who worked closely with him in his final years describe a man who was acutely aware of what was happening, who tracked it, who discussed it in private, and who, according to at least one account, made clear that he had taken steps to ensure his concerns would be heard, even after he was gone. At the time, nobody quite understood what he meant. Now, they are beginning to, because Philip didn't just leave behind a legacy, he left behind a mechanism, and that mechanism has just been activated. But what exactly were Philip's conditions, and how did he make sure they would last beyond his own lifetime? This is the part of the story that has been hiding in plain sight. In the years immediately following the 2005 wedding, something unusual happened inside Buckingham Palace. Camilla's public role expanded, but only to a point. Every time she appeared to be moving toward a more prominent position, something pulled her back, a scheduling conflict, a protocol decision, a quiet word from someone with authority. Royal watchers noticed the pattern but couldn't explain it. Insiders, however, understood exactly what was happening. Philip had made his position known through the one channel that the royal family has always respected above all others: institutional precedent. He had worked, quietly and methodically, with senior courtiers to ensure that certain understandings were embedded into the machinery of the palace itself. Not written policy, not public statements, understandings, the kind that don't need to be written down because everyone involved already knows what they mean. Chief among them was the question of Camilla's title. When Charles and Camilla married, the palace announced that Camilla would use the title Princess Consort rather than Queen Consort when Charles eventually became king. This was presented to the public as Camilla's own preference, a gesture of humility, a sign of respect for Diana's memory. But sources familiar with the internal discussions at the time tell a very different story. The princess consort arrangement was not Camilla's idea, it was a condition, one that Philip had pushed for with considerable force behind closed doors. He believed that the title of Queen carried by Elizabeth, carried by every legitimate consort before her, should not be handed to a woman whose path to the palace had run directly through the destruction of a marriage and the public humiliation of a princess. That was Philip's position, and in 2005, with the wedding still raw and public sympathy for Diana still enormous, it was a position that carried weight. Camilla accepted it, Charles accepted it, and for years it held. But then something changed. In 2021, just months before Philip died, Buckingham Palace quietly announced a shift. When Charles became king, Camilla would be known as Queen Consort after all. The princess consort arrangement, the condition Philip had fought for, was gone. Philip was 99 years old and in declining health when that announcement was made. Whether he was consulted is a matter of significant dispute among those close to the family. Whether he even knew is something that sources describe as deliberately unclear. What is not unclear is his reaction when the subject was raised with him. Those present describe a man who did not shout, did not rage, simply looked at the person who told him and said, according to one account, "We shall see." 2 words. But in Philip's language, 2 words that carried the full weight of everything he had spent decades building. Because Philip understood something that Charles, in his determination to secure Camilla's position, may have underestimated. Conditions don't disappear when the person who set them dies. They wait. They exist in documents, in understandings, in the memories of the people who were in the room when they were made, and eventually, when the circumstances are right, they resurface. Philip had been gone for 4 years when the first signs appeared that something was shifting. 4 years during which Camilla had moved with increasing confidence through the upper levels of the institution. 4 years during which the guardrails Philip had spent decades maintaining had slowly, quietly begun to erode. And then something happened that nobody in the palace was prepared for. Something that made Charles furious. Something that made it clear that Philip's time bomb had not just been ticking, it had gone off. What triggered the crisis now unfolding inside the royal household was not a single dramatic event. It was a document, specifically a set of private correspondence reportedly surfacing through a legal process connected to the settlement of Philip's estate that contained something nobody expected to find, a detailed record of Philip's private objections to Camilla's elevation, written, dated, witnessed, not a will, not a public letter, a private memorandum, the kind that senior members of the royal family have used for generations to record positions they want preserved but not publicized. According to sources familiar with the situation, the document contained Philip's explicit view that the princess consort arrangement should be considered a permanent condition of the marriage, not a temporary public relations measure. It named individuals, it named decisions he considered violations of that condition, and it named a consequence. Specifically, it outlined Philip's belief that if the condition was broken, Certain information he had preserved regarding the period surrounding Diana's death and the early years of Charles and Camilla's relationship should be made available to the institution's senior advisors, not the press, not the public, the institution, the people responsible for protecting the monarchy from exactly the kind of reputational damage Philip had spent his life managing. When this document surfaced, the reaction inside the palace was, according to multiple sources, immediate and severe. Charles was informed, and Charles, by all accounts, was not simply upset. He was furious in the way that only a man who believed a battle was already won can be furious, with the particular cold rage of someone who has just discovered that the ground beneath him is not as solid as he thought. Because here is what makes this moment so significant. Charles has spent years carefully, methodically constructing Camilla's position within the monarchy. He secured her the Queen Consort title. He ensured she stood beside him at the coronation, crowned, visible, legitimate. He has used every tool available to a king to make Camilla's place in the institution feel permanent and unassailable. And now, from beyond the grave, his own father has handed him a document that challenges every single one of those moves. But it is not just the document itself that has caused the crisis. It is what the document has set in motion. Because once senior palace advisors became aware of its existence, a process began that Charles cannot easily stop. Advisors whose job is institutional protection, not personal loyalty to the king, began asking questions about the princess consort arrangement, about the 2021 announcement, about who made the decision, when, and whether Philip was properly consulted. Those questions are, by their nature, uncomfortable. They pull threads, and when you pull threads in an institution as carefully constructed as the British monarchy, you never quite know what unravels. What is known, what sources are now describing with increasing clarity, is that the fallout from Philip's document has reopened a wound that Charles believed was closed. The question of Camilla's legitimacy, not legally, not constitutionally, but institutionally. In the eyes of the people inside the palace who decide every single day how the monarchy presents itself to the world, that question is now live again, and Charles, for the first time since his coronation, finds himself defending ground he thought he had already won. Philip knew this would happen. He designed it this way. The man who spent 70 years serving the institution understood one thing above all others, that in the monarchy, nothing is ever truly settled, not while the documents exist, not while the people who were in the room are still alive, not while someone cared enough to write it down. For a king, there is no such thing as a private crisis. Everything that happens inside that palace, every meeting, every raised voice, every decision made behind closed doors, eventually finds its way out. And what is finding its way out now is a picture of Charles that his team has worked very hard to prevent. A king who is angry, a king who feels cornered, a king who is discovering that the crown his mother wore for 70 years came with complications she never fully prepared him for. Charles has always been a man defined by his relationship with his parents. With Elizabeth, it was complex, a dynamic of deep respect and perpetual emotional distance that royal biographers have documented extensively. But with Philip, it was something else entirely. It was the particular torment of a son who desperately wanted his father's approval and spent most of his life believing he would never fully receive it. Philip was hard on Charles in ways that went beyond normal paternal strictness. He sent him to Gordonstone, the brutal Scottish boarding school Philip himself had attended, over Charles's explicit objections. He pushed him toward a military career that Charles tolerated but never loved. He expressed repeatedly and without much softening his disappointment in Charles's choices, including Camilla, and now, in death, Philip has done something that cuts deeper than any of those earlier criticisms. He has placed Charles in an impossible position, because Charles cannot simply dismiss the document. He is the king. He is the head of an institution that runs on precedent, on process, on the careful management of exactly this kind of internal conflict. If he dismisses his father's memorandum, he risks being seen by the very advisers he depends on as a man who places personal loyalty above institutional integrity. But if he acknowledges it, if he allows the process Philip set in motion to run its course, he risks something far worse. He risks Camilla, and Camilla is the one thing Charles has made clear through every decision of his reign so far that he will not risk. Sources close to the king describe the current atmosphere inside the palace as unusually tense, not the managed tension of a busy institution navigating a difficult news cycle, something quieter, more personal. The tension of a man who has spent decades fighting for something, for Camilla, for their relationship, for the right to have his marriage treated as legitimate and his wife treated as queen, and who now finds that fight reopened by the one person whose opinion always mattered most, his father. There is also, sources suggest, an element of grief in Charles's reaction that is being underestimated. Philip died in April 2021. Charles mourned publicly, briefly, and then returned, with what many observers described as remarkable speed, to the business of the monarchy. But grief, particularly the complicated grief of a difficult father-son relationship, does not resolve that cleanly. And there are those inside the palace who believe that what looks like fury on Charles's part is at least in part something closer to devastation, the realization that his father, even in death, chose the institution over him, chose the conditions over the relationship, chose to leave behind not a blessing but a mechanism. William is watching all of this carefully. He has said nothing publicly, but sources describe a Prince of Wales who is deeply aware of what is unfolding and who understands, perhaps better than anyone, that the outcome of this crisis will define the monarchy he is eventually going to inherit. Whether he is watching with concern or with something more calculated is a question that nobody inside the palace is prepared to answer on the record. But it is being asked, quietly, persistently, in exactly the way Philip would have recognized when Philip's time bomb went off. It didn't just shake Charles and Camilla, it sent tremors through every layer of the institution, and the person feeling those tremors most acutely, after Charles himself, is William. Prince William has spent the years since his grandfather's death in a careful, deliberate process of positioning. He has watched his father's coronation. He has watched Camilla crowned beside him. He has said publicly the right things, that he supports his father, that the family is united, that the monarchy is stable. But William's relationship with Camilla has always been more complicated than the official narrative allows. Royal sources have long described a dynamic between William and his stepmother that is polite, functional, and fundamentally cautious. William has never forgotten what happened to his mother. He was 15 years old when Diana died, old enough to understand the forces that had been at work, old enough to have formed his own conclusions about who bore responsibility, and while he has never, not once, made those conclusions public, they inform every interaction, every decision, every carefully managed public moment between him and the woman who is now queen. Philip understood this dynamic intimately. Some sources go further. They suggest that Philip's memorandum was not written without awareness of how it would land, not just with Charles but with William, that Philip, in his final years, was thinking not just about the institution he had served for 7 decades, but about the institution William would one day lead, and that he wanted to leave William something, not money, not property, a precedent, a record that showed the next king, when he eventually took the throne, that the question of Camilla's position had never been as settled as Charles wanted it to appear. Whether William knows the full contents of the memorandum is unclear. Whether he has been briefed, even partially, by palace advisers is a question that sources answer with careful non-answers. But what is clear is that William is not passive in this moment. He is alert, he is watching, and the people around him are watching too. Beyond William, the fallout reaches into the broader question of what the monarchy looks like in the years ahead. Camilla has worked extraordinarily hard to build public acceptance. Her approval ratings have improved significantly since the early years following Diana's death. She has been visible, diligent, and strategically warm in public, a calculated repositioning that has largely succeeded. But public approval and institutional legitimacy are not the same thing. And what Philip's document has done, whatever its ultimate legal or procedural consequences, is reintroduce doubt into the machinery of the institution itself. Doubt about whether the decisions that elevated Camilla were made cleanly. Doubt about whether the people who should have been consulted were consulted. Doubt about whether the monarchy, in its determination to give Charles what he wanted, may have cut corners that are now beginning to show. Those doubts will not disappear because Charles is furious. They will not disappear because Camilla continues to carry out her public duties with quiet competence. They live in the document, in the process it has triggered, in the conversations now happening at the senior levels of an institution that has survived centuries precisely because it takes these kinds of internal questions seriously. Philip knew all of this. He knew it because he had spent 70 years inside the machine. He knew where the pressure points were. He knew which questions, once asked, could not be easily unasked. And he made a choice, deliberate, calculated, and entirely consistent with the man he had always been, to make sure those questions got asked, even if he wasn't alive to hear the answers. That is Philip's final act, not a farewell, a test, and the monarchy is only beginning to understand what passing it will require. Prince Philip spent his entire life in service to an institution he believed was bigger than any one person, bigger than Charles, bigger than Camilla, bigger than any marriage, any title, any coronation, and in his final act, he made sure the institution knew it. The time bomb he left behind is not a scandal. It is a question, one that the monarchy and everyone watching it now has to answer. Was Camilla's elevation handled the right way? Does Philip's private record of objection change how we see Charles's reign? And what does William do with a precedent his grandfather left him on purpose? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read everything.